Well, according to my clock, it's 4:30, and I want to make sure that we get started in a timely way. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our Tuesday Tailgate Talk. I am excited to introduce Dr. Allan Gray, who is Executive Director for the Center for Food and Agricultural Business, and is also responsible for our MS MBA program as Faculty Director as well. And I think today our plan is really, Allan is going to play a little bit of the role of MC and facilitate a discussion between our guests from Brazil. And I'm going to turn it over to Allan and let him introduce our guests and get the ball rolling. But before I do that, I want to make sure that if you guys have questions, there is the chat feature within Zoom. Feel free to type those in. You can send them to the entire group. You can direct them to Allan or myself, and we'll make sure that they get asked. But also, I think we're okay with if you want to come off of mute and ask your question as well. I'll continue to remind our guests that are going to be speaking to leave time for questions. I know we talked about that before we got started, but I want to make sure I reiterate that as well, that if people have questions, we give them an opportunity to ask. So with that, Allan, I will turn it over to you and we'll just get started.
Great, thanks, Asa. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to have all of you online with us for this opportunity to visit a little bit about Brazil and its success story. I'm going to share a screen here just with a few brief PowerPoints in it that actually may use to surprise my special guests periodically. Let me see if I can, there we go. Let me make sure, let's see, I mean, I shared the right thing there. Yeah, there we go. All right, so yes, for those of you who don't know me, I am Allan Gray, professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics here at Purdue, Executive Director of the Center for Food and Agribusiness. I think when they asked us about the opportunity to do this tailgate talk, one of the reasons was because I had just spent just over a year ago now, I was in Brazil for 9 months on a sabbatical, living in Brazil. So here's an American gringo living in Brazil, trying to figure out how to survive, frankly, in some ways. A country where I don't speak the language and things are done quite a bit differently than they are in the US. So I had some experience there, but more importantly, I had two very close friends of mine that are experts in Brazil because they are Brazilians, right? So we've got a chance to have Dr. Luciano Castro with us here. Luciano's been affiliated with the Center for Food and Agribusiness for a number of years now. He's been to Purdue a couple different times, was a professor here with us for about a year. He's now moved back to Brazil and works as one of the principals in a company called Marcastrat. Works in the agribusiness industries every day in Brazil, and also continues to work with us in U.S. companies here in the United States as well. So he has a nice perspective of both U.S. And Brazil. Also joining us as our guest here is Dr. Lourival Monaco Neto. Lourival is also a consultant in Brazil, and he is also a postdoc researcher in the Center for Food and Agricultural Business, but he's doing that from Brazil because, as we'll talk about a little bit later here, perhaps, he can't come to the United States right now for various reasons that we'll talk a little bit about. So, but eventually we hope that he does get here. So our entire session today is meant to be pretty laissez-faire in some ways. It's just going to be an open discussion. I put together an outline of the things that I thought we ought to talk about as it relates to Brazil and its agribusiness success, but also Brazil in general. And Luciano's first response back to me when I sent him in the outline was, wow, this is an entire course in Brazil. Allan, how are we going to do that in 1 hour? And I said, well, we probably won't do all of it in 1 hour, but we'll talk about some of these things that I find interesting. So I have a couple of opening comments before I get to my guests, just to give us all some sense of what we're talking about here. I actually like to remind myself of this periodically. So thanks to Lourival, he put this slide up for me so that I could share it with you. just to remind those in the audience who aren't that familiar with Brazil, first of all, where is it? It's the largest country in South America, right? And the second thing is for you to understand how large it is, right? So 852 million hectares are in Brazil, and there's 983 million hectares in the U.S. And so if you superimpose Brazil onto the U.S., which you see in the right-hand graph there, you get some sense of the size of Brazil. And I do that for my American colleagues who may not be familiar, because I think most people who don't know much about Brazil don't realize how big it is. It is a very, very large country, almost exactly the same size as the U.S., just slightly smaller than the continental U.S., I should say. We don't include Alaska and Hawaii in this picture, so you can see it doesn't quite cover all the U.S., although it does go all the way up into Canada and part of the Gulf of Mexico. So it's pretty close to the same size as the United States, and I think that's an important thing to remember. The other slide I wanted to share with you is one that I've been using for a while now, trying to talk about why is Brazil important to the U.S. Of course, Brazil is important to the U.S. from the standpoint of agriculture and agribusiness, and we'll get into why that's so important. But I ask people all the time, should we be following what's happening in Brazil? Does it matter? And folks always answer it, but then they suggest they don't really know things about reading about Brazil. Well, one of the things I would tell you is that The Economist has done a pretty amazing job over time of really kind of focusing on Brazil, because Brazil is a very important country in the world. And it's also a country that's quite an enigma, because the Economist was convinced in 2009 that Brazil was about to lead the world into a whole new era. And by September of 13, they had decided that Brazil had completely blown it. And by February of 2015, it was a really big mess. And by the 16th, by 2016, they don't have a political system that they can count on anymore. And by April of 2016, they call it the Betrayal of Brazil. So we've gone all the way from Brazil as the leader to Brazil as a mess, right? And I think that in some ways, this is a sad testament of the story of Brazil in some ways. And it's the story that we often get from the outside. And I think my two colleagues would say it's not untrue that there is a lot to Brazil and its young democracy that we'll talk about in a minute that is going through fits and starts to try to find its way in the world. And it's struggling to move from this developing country, or even underdeveloped country in some ways, to one of the developed economies of the world. And I would like to spin it in a positive way to say, okay, this is a roller coaster. It is up and down, but this is a country that's continuing to fight to put itself in place to be one of the developed countries of the world. And that's why it's so important for us to continue to follow them. And I anticipate The Economist continuing to feature Brazil on the cover of their magazine as Brazil continues its roller coaster ride into the future. So that's a little bit just sort of my opening comments to you about what's happening in Brazil, how I see it sort of being shaped through its history a little bit. So I want to start by asking some really easy questions of my colleagues if they studied their history carefully while they were in grade school in Brazil, right? So Brazil, the country, was colonized by who?
Well, by the Portuguese, right? That was a very easy one. Next one, please, Allan.
Luciano, so yes. So for those who don't know in the audience there, it was colonized by the Portuguese, and that's really the reason why it's a Portuguese-speaking country. That's ultimately the reason for it. And interesting fact about Brazil, those who don't know, it is the only Portuguese-speaking country in South America. And in some ways that matters, does it not, Lourival, that we have this very large, almost dominant country in South America, but it speaks a completely different language from the rest of the continent.
Yeah, and it's a big deal because it is a language that doesn't have a lot of speakers throughout the world, right? So here in Brazil, if you're gonna do business outside of the country, you need a second language, right? And more importantly, if you start to think about how the country was created, we have many people coming from Europe. So the southern part of Brazil has a different accent because they're mainly European. We have the biggest colony of Japanese outside of Japan in Brazil too. So although it's a big country, it's very diverse. It's almost a continent filled with smaller countries inside of it. And we all speak Portuguese, but it's quite different from one place to the other.
Yeah, we like to say that we are a Portuguese-speaking country surrounded by, Portuguese-speaking islands surrounded by Spanish-speaking countries, or a Spanish-speaking ocean, I would say.
Right. And in some ways, it's Luciano, it maybe has held you back a little bit in terms of how dominant you might otherwise would be as sort of the dominant force of South America. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, yeah, we are many times, I would say, oriented to ourselves. So it's really like the markets sometimes focus too much domestic markets instead of, and of course, this is different for different industries. But for sure, many different industries would think first for the domestic markets, before exporting. I like to compare with the Netherlands, for instance. Such a small, tiny country, so much to the international markets.
Yeah, in some ways also, we feel like we are almost left out of South America, or we are our own thing within South America. Because the countries that speak Spanish, they have this bond between them that we don't share, right? So it's so much easier for them to do business with each other, to talk to each other, to have less legislation going between the countries. And here in Brazil, it's sort of like always the one out. We're always doing our own stuff. So we have our own agreements, and it feels like we're the odd one out most of the time.
So I hadn't planned to go down this path, but we'll go down it just for a moment. English is increasingly more broadly spoken in Brazil. And of course, you do have plenty of people there because you've got to do business in South America who speak Spanish as well. But increasingly, particularly the bigger cities and the more educated populations are speaking English on a pretty regular basis. But my experience was there's a big dichotomy. You get away from the big cities and the educated areas into the countryside, and that's not always the case. And in fact, that's often not the case, that folks can't speak English or any other language for that matter. They only speak Portuguese. And so there's sort of this big difference in the sort of population of there's correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a segment of the population that's beginning to face the rest of the world, speak English, speak Spanish, do more export oriented, do more work with more countries, and another whole group of the population that's very, very internally focused, familial, often rural, and poor, and only speak one language. That is sort of what I like to say is this is just one case where it's the case, but there's often two Brazils. Is that true?
Yeah, that's perfect, Alan. And I wouldn't say just for international languages, but also, the country is full of inequalities, in terms of education and income level. And for sure, learning English, learning Spanish would be a part of the reality of the richer, I would say, living in the country, having the means to have an education to be able to learn English, for instance.
Yeah, I think one thing that I heard, I think Alan saying one time when he was here, that that Brazil is a country of haves and have-nots. The people that are able to acquire education, acquire land or assets as a whole, and the people that cannot. It is a very country of inequalities, as Luciano said, and those are very clear. That you can see that anywhere you go, even in the big cities. You're walking down the street, you can see like this huge store, fancy clothes and all those things, and there gonna be someone sitting down on the street just asking for money, just beside it. That's the kind of dichotomy that you can see here in Brazil almost all the time. Everywhere you go, you're gonna see that.
And to provide some context on this, Lourival, you provided me with this slide, and I've done some looking at this slide and some other statistics as well to kind of show what the Brazilian GDP per capita is. Right? And I think that Brazilian GDP per capita, let me see mouse here real quick.
Yeah, that's precisely almost $9,000 per year.
Just about $9,000 per year. And I just want to remind our audience that that's not, that's in US dollars. It's not inflated or deflated in any way. That's the US dollars per person. And if you were to compare that to the US for a US comparison, that's the US is $63,000, I think, right now. 63,000 to 8,700. So there's a huge difference in terms of the overall income per person, where Brazil is still far, far behind the US with respect to income per person. But what you've been talking most about is more of this pyramid and this significant dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots in Brazil. It's actually, the difference here would be that 66% of your families are really in sort of the poverty frame. In the US, our middle income group is bigger than yours. We've grown substantially, our middle income group. We do also have a low income group. We just don't have nearly as many of them as you have. And this is a real contrast, I think, that often when I take students to see Brazil during our MSMBA program, this is the thing that I want to have them understand, is that there are two Brazils. And one of them is Brazil does have, admittedly, a very difficult problem with poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think this is this happens in all industries. You know, we're talking about the general population here, and it means that, you know, for the ones at the upper class, we have a huge amount of people, and therefore, you know, we have like Ferrari offering in a dealership, you know, selling a lot of cars every year. I think it's one of the highest selling stores in the world is kind of located in São Paulo, which is kind of very surprising, right? But at the same time, we have this huge poor population. And it's also reflected when you think about agriculture, for instance. We're gonna see, you know, farmers in a very sophisticated condition in terms of size, in terms of technology, but at the same time, we have subsistence farmers living in very poor conditions and just trying to produce to themselves. So it's like I said, you know, we have many countries inside one country, and therefore, you know, and I have to remind you that I'm a marketing person, so segmentation and targeting is something critical here, because when you start thinking about the market and industries, you have to start, you know, ask yourself what sorts of people we're talking about, what sorts of segments are. It's very different according to where you are heading to.
Yeah, and to illustrate, you know, this huge gap that we have the 9th biggest economy in the world, and we have the 73rd position as far as GDP per capita. So yeah, we have a lot of people. We're around 220 million people here, and that is very poorly divided, you know. So that's where those big differences appear.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about too was you really can't talk about Brazil, in my judgment, from my experience. You can't talk about them without talking a little bit about politics. But I'm not so interested in politics in the way we might be thinking about it in the news today, but really more about sort of government and structure and the way that it happens. You know, I think I read today, Brazil became an independent country from Portugal in 1855, maybe, or something like that, right? So about a little less than 100 years after the U.S. got its independence, Brazil became independent. But you spent a great deal of time there in sort of a monarchy, I think, for a period of time, not really in a democracy, and then maybe you were in some form of a democracy in sort of what they call the old republic. And then I think went through a military sort of regime, and then back to democracy. And so democracy, both of you have were alive, and in your formative years when you became what we consider in Brazil, I think, the new republic, right? Tell me a little bit about that new republic and sort of what's happened to put us into what kind of government we have today.
Yeah, that's interesting point, Alan. We are very, like you said in the beginning, we are a very young democracy. After the military regime, our first president elected was in 1989. I was alive, like you said, right? um, we have here a different system than the U.S. system. Here, one citizen, one vote. So we don't have delegates or states. And another important thing is voting is obliged. So everyone has to vote. If you don't vote, you have to justify, you have to pay a penalty or whatever, you have to show up and vote. So that's kind of a different system. We have had then the very first president elected, he was impeached after 1 year and a half or so. And then we had other two terms of, I would say, compared to the others, maybe a successful government, which was Fernando Henrique Cardoso. I think the names now don't really matter, but and then we started with this more left-oriented government that started with Lula, someone that became famous from coming from the poverty and really reaching the level to be a president of the country. He created a lot of hope. And of course, in a moment that the road was growing, and I would say the economy was growing as well. So I think in terms of the distribution of income, I think we have had some progress. But on the other hand, we had a lot of corruption problems and a lack of investment on things that we would consider structural platforms to a continuous growth. We have had so many corruption problems, and that, after Lula 2 terms, we had Dilma, who was kind of elected by his power, I would say. He was impeached as well. And the country was so tired of, these scandals and I would say poor management, that we ended up electing someone that somehow took the leadership at that moment to be more like a radical, opposite force to what actually the government was at that time. And then I think it was a kind of an adventure. It was like, we have an expression here in Brazil, we say a shot in the dark. It's like everyone chose him because everyone thought, he was the only one capable of defeating this left-oriented party. And you have the election in 2 terms here. So at some point, it was obvious that he would be competing with this other candidate coming from the same party as Lula and Dilma and so on. So we had an expression at that time here, we said useful vote. So I don't really like to vote in Bolsonaro, who actually ended up as being the president. But if I don't vote for Bolsonaro, I'm sure, the Labour Party would return to the government. So it was someone, making a long story short, but it was someone, kind of a low-profile deputy with not so many interesting projects that kind of stood out, and had a voice. And now he's in charge. And it's been an adventure being under his administration, I would say.
Yeah, and I just want to add that when we're talking about structure, right, we have the 3 powers in Brazil the same way in US. So we have the judiciary, legislative, and the executive the same way. We have the 2 house structure, the House of Representatives and the Senate, just the same way, the same idea. But the difference is here, and it's a huge difference, right, is that we don't have this 2 parties a system that US has, the Republicans and the Democrats. We have about 40-something parties, right? So we have what we call a coalition system, in that the president, when he's elected, he needs to have some sort of number of parties that back him up when he tries to pass some sort of bill, right? And what that brings is that he has sort of to sell, with, positions in the government and being secretary or something. He has to sell pieces of the government to those parties so they'll back him up when he tried to pass some sort of bill or some sort of reform. We saw that very clearly when we're restructuring our pension system here in Brazil. That was completely flawed and broken. And he had to commit so much to those parties that it is not clear where he's going. It's very similar when people say that, you know, Trump is not either Republican or Democrat. He is himself. We see the same way as Bolsonaro. He's mostly himself, but in a different way, that he needs a lot of parties. Now, actually, he's without a party. He's not in the same party he was elected from. So, and I like to say that in Brazil, we have seen some sort of pendular system, that we went as far left as we can go, with actually 4 terms and 2 presidents in the more left system. And when we mean, what we mean by left here in Brazil, it's a little bit different from US. What we mean is a bigger state, is a welfare system that gives a lot of money to people, is more like a socialist sort of thinking. It's not like in the US, when you say left, you're talking about more about progressive, you know, about civil liberties, that kind of stuff. It's a little bit different. When we talk about liberal here in Brazil, we're talking more like a economical liberal, you know, open state, open economy. That it's important to make those distinctions when we talk about policies and where we think that the country is going.
Well, so thanks for taking us through that a little bit. I think it's important for the audience to take away a couple of big things. One is you're either on number 6 or number 7 president in your current democracy, which is one similar to what ours looks like. So when I show the Economist, and it shows all this up and down roller coaster stuff, this is a young, really young democracy trying to learn its way forward in terms of how it's going to sort of govern a very large country with a 213 million people, right? So you're not as large as the U.S., but you nearly are, landmass wise, but also in terms of population, a very large population with a very difficult poverty situation, right? And I know we do this because we do it here too. We bash on our governments all the time, and we do this in Brazil, and we talk about all the bad things about Brazil. I want to be a bit positive about it. So, you know, it's a young democracy trying to find its way. I think both of you have told me before that you have some confidence in the overall structure of the government, that you have enough sort of strength building in your institutions that you feel more confident your democracy is likely to survive these fits and starts rather than go back to some sort of military thing or some other government, that you've got a chance your constitution, at least, and sort of your structure will maintain. And that's, I think, some good positive things about where you see Brazil seeing stability over time. It just is a rough path to get there, it seems to me like. And remember, we're at president 6, or no, we're at president 7 now in this new democracy. And so when you get to presidents, I don't know what we're on now these days. I forget, president 48 or 49 or 50 or 50, whichever one it is, right? We're far, far, far ahead of you from that perspective. Well, let's go to some modern day stuff real quick. We might as well talk about COVID real quickly because everybody wants to know about it. And this is a place for the Brazilians to be proud. Proud because you're not nearly as bad as the United States. So tell us a little bit about what's happening with COVID there now. What's the situation like? What's life like? How are you living? Tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Okay, I will start, and Lourival, you please complete the story. As you can see by these numbers, you know, the country was hardly hit, you know, by the virus. We are reaching 70,000 deaths so far, and probably 2 million infected people very shortly. I think the story is pretty similar to the US, I would say, but it is worse at some extent. You know, we have had a kind of a very flexible quarantine idea. That's what I would, you know, kind of, if you will, you know, it's by 2 main reasons. One is lack of leadership. We had, for instance, mayors saying one thing, and then the governor saying another thing, and the president of the country kind of ignoring the problem or the situation. And I think this lack of leadership and kind of single direction, it didn't create the confidence, you know, that people had to do some kind of effort to prevent, you know, the spread out of the virus. A second problem, and I think it really is related to our reality, it is related to being a poor country. You know, just people have to go out to make their living. And we have this, what we call the favelas here. People just packed, and not just in their homes, but also for using the public transportation. So for those people who they can, starve to death, or they just have to go to work, for them wasn't really able to stay at home. And so I would say that for these reasons, I think the disease has grown so much. Of course, we have lack of infrastructure, sometimes considering the public health system, but also the private health system. As I said, different realities. At the same time, we have the poor ones going to the public system. We do have a kind of a universal service, supposedly available for every Brazilian citizen, but it's not actually what happens, because you may go there and don't find a place for you if you need intensive care. But we also have the private systems, such as people like Lourival and myself. We pay not only the taxes that we pay, but we also pay for the private service for health and for having health services. So so these inequalities in this situation. This is what we are doing. We have right now, maybe, we are 27 states, around 10 states, we have stable numbers. Other 12 numbers are getting worse, growing, again, infected people and number of deaths. And maybe 5 or 6, we have declining numbers, like Rio and even São Paulo city and other areas like the Amazonas, where the Amazon is. Decline. It seems that we have reached a level, because people got infected, so the virus cannot keep spreading out. It seems that the infection level has this.
We lost Luciano there for a minute. Lourival, maybe you can add a little bit to that from your perspective.
Yeah. So so one thing that we need to, it's a good parallel for us to think about, is that what happened to New York, right? It was the first and the biggest center of COVID in US. Was the same thing for São Paulo. The great São Paulo area, or the city of São Paulo, the greater area, it's about 20 million people, right? So there, it's where all started, or where the biggest boom of the virus was. And now what we see there is that the virus has slowed down very much. So the cases there are going down. The inflection has been seen already, right? So now the virus is moving towards the interior. So the interior cities of São Paulo have seen an increase, but where it's booming now, it's some very similar to what happened in US, that now we see Florida and California with greater numbers. The same thing we're seeing now with the northeast part of the country. That is where the virus is spreading more. But I think the most important thing that we need to think of is that this virus has actually made the inequalities of the country way more clear for us to see. And the reason why is that the poorer you are, not only that you have to go out and work, but the less your health is being taken care of. Although we have a universal health system, and I would love to have this discussion with an American sometime, because this is a topic that has been brought up several times during elections and now, in American politics. But my wife is a doctor. She works in hospitals. And what we can see, and she tells me all the time, is that we have islands of good health system, public health system throughout the country, but that's not the reality. If you go to a city that has, a good income and has good doctors and has a good infrastructure, yeah, it works. But if you go to the poorest, not even the poorest, but not as wealthy parts of the country, that's not going to work. It's not enough doctors, not enough infrastructure. And those places are the places that are suffering. So if you look at there's been a study that within São Paulo city, they look at the numbers for neighborhoods, and the poor neighborhoods, the death rate is like twice or even 5 times greater than the wealthiest part of the city, right? So it has shown us that the inequalities, they have more effect when you stress people, when you have them in a situation of danger, and they are in danger. The poor, I mean, I can tell Luciano and we are able to work from home. We have good internet. We have, good infrastructure to work from home. But people that cannot, they have to take the bus out to go to work. Those are the ones that are being hit the hardest, and they're the one dying.
Yeah, so the situation is actually similar to the way it is here in the U.S., but probably more pronounced there, just because you have such this dichotomy between where you have such a large population of poor folks that are suffering there. We knew that might be the case. Luciano, I see you're back with us. Also, just one other quick thing on COVID, just from an economy perspective, I assume it's similar to here in the U.S. You shut down most of your restaurants for a period of time, a pretty big shock in terms of reduction in demand of that side of sort of the food industry. Is that the case?
Yes, in terms of GDP, we are heading to probably a -5% in terms of decrease in GDP growth or decline, as you like, this year. And of course, if you think about restaurants and all the food service as being hardly affected, such as in the US, I guess, for those who were prepared to have an online channel, of course, the damage was less worse than it was for the ones who were not prepared. So I think in other areas, for instance, I've worked with the people from the cotton industry and textile being hardly hit also by this crisis. People just not willing to buy new clothes and just rethinking their expenditures in general.
Yeah, and one good number to think about this is that we're reaching about 13% of unemployment rate. Yeah. So, and a lot of this is, of course, due to the COVID situation. Although we were about 11 before it, so you have to take this information with a grain of salt.
Right. The other area of agriculture that I know was impacted substantially for you, as it was here in the U.S., was the meat industry. I think you've had some struggles there, just like we have.
At the beginning, actually, we had a booster, I would say, because since China was expected to recover sooner than the rest of the world, and we know that China is very powerful, consumer from Brazilian products, Brazilian meat, exports started to accelerate to really supply the Chinese. But then now, I would say that we started to have the same problems that I heard in the US, slaughterhouses having enormous amount of people being infected, and they need to shut down the operations and those kind of things. So I would say right now that's the reality that we're living, but maybe next week things change again, because the impact on exports, meat exports, are really impressive. Is it really impressive?
Yeah, the flour sector here actually was one of that were hit the hardest. I mean, we're talking about a 4.5 billion reais sector. It's quite big, and it lost 70% of its revenue over COVID.
Similar to like the Netherlands, I understand they had a disastrous situation with the flour industry, right? Yeah.
But it's interesting to talk about the COVID impact on agribusiness, because if you think about the industries, the segments of the agribusiness industry that is more oriented to the domestic market, such as flour, such as even ethanol, vegetables, they were really affected. But if you think about, for instance, soybean, corn, even sugar, cotton, they are exporting more than exported last year. They are taking the opportunity of the value of the dollar right now, and they having had positive impacts right now. So it's kind of a very funny situation here, because at the same time that we have a very difficult situation for some of those segments, we have others progressing and celebrating interesting results at this point.
Yeah.
Interesting that you raised that, because that next slide just happened to be the exchange rate that I was going to bring up, and I was doing that mostly just to tease both of you, because and really maybe tease myself, because there was a time when I was living there right back here, and I probably should be there now because Brazil's quite a bit on sale. It's really cheap right now at 5.35 exchange rate is pretty incredible, right?
Yeah.
You would be a king here. You were, by the way, but you would be a king.
So, but I think it really matters to our audience here in the sense of, what's happening with Brazil. One of the things is that you're a huge export oriented agribusiness in general, and from the standpoint of exchange rates relative to the U.S., because you're unique in some ways. The U.S. dollar is actually decreasing in value for many countries, but not for Brazil relative to Brazil's currency. So your commodities to the rest of the world look quite attractive from a pricing perspective. And so you got a kind of a boost in demand there.
Yes, and at this moment we have, although we have low commodity prices, but they are not so low that the dollar price cannot compensate that value. And so in the end, the revenues for farmers, for trading companies are higher. And I think this is creating a positive impact for the industry. And of course, I bring that impact backwards to the retailers, to the ag input, manufacturers, and all people involved in this industry.
Right.
Yeah, I saw this number a couple of days ago. It said that from January to April, the GDP of agribusiness in Brazil has grown 3.83% compared to the same time last year. Right, so it's a big increase in a short, just a quarter, a third of the year. So overall, you can say that this year has been a very good year for agribusiness. I don't like to say that COVID has a positive impact on agribusiness. I don't like that to word it that way, but some of the impacts, the exchange rate and the demand in some countries and all those things, and the fact that food is the last thing that you're gonna stop buying when you're in a crunch. All those added to a situation that agribusiness is making more money now than it was making last year.
So, and in fact, Lourival, I don't want to put you on the spot too much here, but I know your family, you and your family, you're involved in the citrus industry. And one of the things that's been kind of an interesting impact from the COVID idea is a tremendous increase in demand for orange juice. And that's got to have been a good situation from a Brazilian perspective, because you are the number one exporter of orange juice in the world. In fact, I think you might be the number one supplier of orange juice in the world, not just exporter, but you make more orange juice than everywhere else in the world, right there in Brazil, where the two of you live, correct?
Yeah, that's true. We used to fight, head to head with Florida, but due to a lot of stuff, the greening and the other diseases and financial situation in Florida, that Florida is not that big of a contender. It is a great contender, but not as big as it used to be. And we were talking about, how COVID impacts some of the behaviors, of consumers, especially regarding the food system. And the consumption of orange juice was one of those. For the first year in decades, we've seen a rise in orange juice consumption. And that was because you have to remember, orange juice is something that we used to have as kids growing up. So it has that comforting aspect to it. It brings back memories of childhood, that kind of stuff. But also, on the other hand, it has a very high sugar content, right? So when we're talking about eating healthier and, more stuff that we had this discussion for years in agribusiness, it was going against that flow. But now that was one of the behaviors that changed greatly during that time. And that increased because you have to remember, as a commodity, orange juice, the frozen concentrate orange juice, that it's the commodity sold, it's priced in dollars, right? So Brazil, being the major exporter of orange juice, the income that comes from that has increased greatly. So the price that my family it's receiving by the box, which is 40.8 kilos of oranges, had actually increased a lot from last season, right? So it is actually very good. So we have a increasing price and demand at the same time, which is very rare to see.
So as we get a little bit more into this ag discussion, I'm watching the time here carefully too. I want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, don't forget to type them into the chat. We'll be happy to answer those questions. Got an opportunity here to ask these two guys in country living what's happening in Brazil to answer the questions you may be interested in, besides just answering the things that I'm interested in. I did put a chart up here to kind of give us just an overall sense of the importance of agriculture to Brazil. It's consistently 20% or more of GDP in the US, in Brazil. That's substantially more than it is here in the US, right? It's probably one of your most important industries.
Yeah.
Overall.
Yeah, and it's very important. But I think more than that, being 21% of Brazil's GDP, it's the greatest income generator of the country, right? The trade balance in agribusiness, it's greater than the sum of all the other sectors' trade balance. It's actually what makes us make money in our foreign exchange. You know, it barely makes any imports, and it exports a huge amount. So in that sense, it's very important to understand how the income generation part of the agribusiness is important to the country.
Yeah, in fact, I have that, Lourival, I had that slide. I didn't share it with the group, but the number was kind of interesting to me. So I think your overall trade balance in Brazil is positive, $46 billion, I think, of positive trade balance. But agriculture by itself is 83 billion in positive trade balance. So if you didn't have agriculture in your trade, it would be a negative trade balance. Agriculture is the only thing that makes it into a positive trade balance for you, which makes you, from that perspective, makes you, a powerful industry. Agriculture is a powerful industry for Brazil because of what it does for the country's overall income position. So.
It does that without almost any governmental incentive. We don't have subsidies almost at all. We don't have, we might have some subsidized interest rates, but that we don't have sort of like a prevent planting project or policy. We have what my family likes to say. I'm an agronomist. My family, we like to say the best help the government can give us is not getting in the way. Don't try to help. Don't try to make it worse. Just let us do what we know what to do. That's the thing.
So I have a comment from an audience member. It happens to be an audience member who should probably be leading a fair amount of this discussion because it's Marshall Martin. And hey, Marshall, how are you? Marshall is a resident expert here at Purdue in Brazil for sure. And he asked a very good question, and one that we should probably cover just so that people understand in this bigger picture. We mentioned briefly a little bit about the sort of challenge of the economy in this very large sector of the poor population, but he also asks a little bit about, we should think a little bit about what happens with education in Brazil, and maybe y'all can describe sort of the education system in Brazil, the way it is, and what the challenges are that creates.
Yeah. So it is really related to the conversation we had in the beginning, related to the inequalities that we have in the country. So at the same time that we have an upper class that, for sure, in Lourival and myself, we were privileged to have this opportunity in the sense that we had a very good educational level. The great majority, unfortunately, really do not access, an education of quality, which means that they probably will not represent a very productive labor or entrepreneurs in the end in the economy. So things are really related, and that's something that, for instance, we would hope from this current government to not only to think strategically, but it's a huge educational reform, to put Brazil on the track, in a way to for instance, do as other countries did. We use the example of South Korea or other countries that catch up in a way that others invest in education. So that's something that we hope that that is being fixed. But honestly, right now, what's coming from the federal government and the type of private investment that has been done, it doesn't make us very optimistic, but it's something that we've been fighting for I would say for some time.
And just to give you an idea of what our educational systems looks like, at least the college level, the public schools, the public colleges in Brazil are free, right? So Luciano and I, we had opportunity to do our undergrad and our grad school for free, right? But that's a problem because now these institutions that are great, that are huge, they are lacking the investment to maintain themselves as top schools as they were in the past. They still are very good, like very, very good, but not as good as they used to be because there's not enough funding coming only from the government.
And so, and I think it's important to connect the system, at least from my perspective when I was there. It's a really unique system, not unique, this happens in some other countries too, but it's very different from the US. So your undergraduate, your universities are free, but for your public universities, not your private, but your public university. But your public universities, the entrance standards are really high because otherwise everybody would be going to the public university and you couldn't even run the system at all. So your gatekeeping is not EIs, your gatekeeping is standards, testing, that people have to test to be able to get into the public system. Well, your public pre-college, your high school, junior high, the public system is terribly underfunded and not well suited for educating students to do well in testing, as I understand it. Yeah. And so then what happens is those that have income, they take their children and they put them into private schools, which are much better prepared and do a much better job of preparing the students to take the exams. So what ends up happening is those that go to the public schools are the wealthier, tend to be the wealthier students who had parents who could put them in the private schools to allow them to pass the test to get into free college. Did I explain, is that how the system actually works?
It is, and
correct. That's been true for 50 years.
I'm sorry, Marshall, go ahead.
You are correct, Allan, and that's been true for over half a century. They have to pass the vestibular, so they go to private schools and even private training after high school to prepare to take the test to get a high score on the test.
Yeah, I did that. I had a second school that I went to just for preparing.
Just a comment here. It hasn't been like this, for all the time. And my dad, he studied in a public school for his basic education. At that time, the public school was the best one. And then, it was a way for them to access the best universities. It was due to the lack of investment in the public education system that they lost quality. And then the private kind of basic education replaced the public basic education. Unfortunately, this is happening also for the college education right now. So the private system is kind of slowly replacing, let's say, the excellence of the public system in several fields. This is due to the lack of investment capacity coming from the government, because funding the whole education system is not easy for the government. And I would say, Allan, that the system is kind of broken. I'm glad you took your time to understand the system, but we are not happy with that, and we have to fix it. And we had a lot of hope in this government and next governments that would fight the incentives in place, because people, of course, live out of incentives to change the situation.
Yeah, the system the way it is not gonna hold itself. As Luciano said, it's broken. And we can see it's falling apart. Like the great universities, they're not as great as they used to be. And they're going to continue that path unless something change, at least in the funding system. I think a hybrid system in the beginning should be something that should be addressed, at least in the shorter term.
Good. And I thank you, Marshall, for bringing that up. And even Maria Pisani made a comment here as well, similar ideas, that right now, the way the system is, you basically have to go to the private education system in order to be able to advance yourself into the future. And that's really not what the original design of the Brazilian system was. But like you said, it's broken, right? So as we wait for others to ask questions here, and feel free to post your questions so we can get to the things that may be of interest to you. I think we've got to address something that's important for us to to talk about. So we're burning all of the Amazon forest down completely so that we can grow more and more and more soybeans.
Yeah,
Right.
that's
You want to
so
go
sad
first,
to hear.
Luciano?
Yes, I can go first. We can be talking about this for another Tuesday, I would say. You know, let's the great problem here is the messages and there are a lot of misunderstanding about this situation. So first, the Brazilian agriculture doesn't need the Amazon to grow or to export or to reach the numbers that we have just spoken about. You know, the Brazilian agriculture in terms of cattle, you know, livestock in general, if I think about coffee, you think about cotton, soybean, corn, it's being produced all over the country. So it doesn't mean that Amazon doesn't have its problems. It does have serious problems, and it's been growing recently, and we have to fight these problems. The problem is to link, you know, the Amazon deforestation with the Brazilian agriculture success. That's the point. So we have to have this separation. It's just like, I will force a comparison here, but it's just like I would blame and I would try to block, you know, US exports because of the fires in California, right? So because of some national park in California is burning, I would say, you know, I'm raising a import barrier from, you know, US because you're destroying your national parks in California, right? So that being said, let me clarify. We have had problems in the Amazon. It's true that, you know, the deforestation rate has been growing. Recently, I would say for the last 2 years, what's happening there is, and again, lots of speculation, lots of discussions about this, but normally, you know, land or vegetation has been cleared for, you know, illegal land trade or just maybe livestock for raising cattle in a moment. And also for, you know, in the end, people can say that, you know, this land becomes to me or belongs to me. So there is a kind of an illegal deforestation activity there that has to be fought, and a problem that, you know, the present government has been not dealing accordingly. That's why many, even, you know, Brazilian agribusiness corporations are protesting against it because they kind of understand that that might be a problem for their exports, for their activities when dealing with other countries. So just to summarize, and I just let Lourival to speak about it, but the point is we do have problems. We cannot deny that, but there is a kind of forced connection between things that we do not agree. That's the point.
Yeah. So I want to build on top of what Luciano said. So one thing needs to be clear, like crystal clear. We do have a problem, and the Amazon is being cut down at some point. But first of all, this is a criminal activity. We do not endorse it. Our government do not endorse it. Although the speech sometimes may sound like they endorse it, and that's a whole different issue we need to talk about sometime, is that words have power. And when you say that you're not gonna punish or that you don't think that's that big of a deal, it has a real tangible effect, right? But let's just start with the point that that's illegal. That should not be done, right? That being said, we still have 2/3 of the country with natural vegetation. 66% of the country, it's natural vegetation, right? On top of that, we have the most, I wanna use a word that farmers use, the hardest environmental law in the world. So just for you to have an idea, in the southern part of Brazil, São Paulo State, Paraná, Mato Grosso, Minas Gerais, the southern states of Brazil, we have to have, by law, 20% of our land has to be covered with forest or natural vegetation. If you don't have it, you have to plant it. That's one thing. In the Amazon region, in the Amazon biome, it's 80% by law, right? So if you don't have 80% of natural vegetation in your land, in the Amazon biome, you cannot get public funding. Most banks are not going to loan money to you. You're going to have all sorts of trouble, right? So this is really important. And one thing that Luciano said, and I cannot stress this enough, is that real farmers, agribusiness farmers and agribusiness companies, they abide by this law. They work with this law because they are, exporting stuff. They have their names attached to these environmental laws. We're talking about how COVID affected, agribusiness and all business. One thing that is clear is that all companies are going to be held responsible by sustainability. And one of the pillars of sustainability is being responsible with the environment, right? So those companies, they're not gonna cut down the Amazon to plant whatever. First of all, that's not how it happens. When a illegal activity occurs, they cut down the big trees and they sell the wood. Then they burn down whatever is left, and they put, few animals there, mostly cattle, and they leave it there. We're talking about like half an animal per hectare, or not even that. We're talking less than one animal per acre. And then after years of that, they come with soybeans and that kind of stuff. And that's how it usually happens. Second thing is that, you go on now.
Sorry, Lourival, we're running just a bit short of time here. I just want to make a couple of quick comments. One was, so you were talking about the 80% set aside. That's in the Amazon biome. That's even a strip of area, a large area that's outside of the Amazon. It's the part that's adjacent to the Amazon they have to do the 80% set aside on. Second comment I would make is that Brazil has substantial plans to expand its crop production capacity and its ability to continue to export in the world. And it can do all of that without and you can do all of that and fulfill those plans without ever touching the Amazon. And that's something that I want to leave our audience with, is for them to understand that there's plenty of capabilities in Brazil on only a third of the land, because 67% of it's in natural land. We can do with the rest of that land still dramatic increases in production over the production that we've already seen in our history. So there's a pretty substantial potential still available there in the land that's not Amazon, right? So those are some of the things that we want to talk about. Of course, like Luciano said, we have an entire course we could talk about on Brazil. We have many, many more things that we could be talking about. Very interesting conversations today about helping people understand. We read a lot about agriculture, so I intentionally today try to take the first half or so of this and really talk about some other broader aspects of Brazil, because it's all connected. Brazil has a tremendous agribusiness engine, but it's connected to its government, to its people, to its poverty, to its education, and those things are all going to have to work together for Brazil to be able to achieve its aspirations of becoming one of the leaders of the world. I think there's still real potential for that to happen, and I think my colleagues do too. Luciano, thank you for taking the time today to visit with us. Lourival, thank you for the time to visit with us. For the audience out there, thank you for being with us, and we'll be sure and share these slides with you so that everybody has them. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.